Hello everyone and welcome back to another book review. Today I am going to be reviewing Music in Medieval Manuscripts. This is by Nicolas Bell, and this is part of a nonfiction series that I have been reading in no particular order, where the formula for the title is blank in medieval manuscripts. So the series takes a topic that was maybe relevant or important in medieval times and explores it through the lens of what we can glean from medieval manuscripts. So like astrology in medieval manuscripts is one of the other ones that I've read. So any topic that was relevant in the medieval times. This series aims to take a brief introduction with a blend of art and text in the book itself. These books are quite short. They're around 60-70 pages, so it really is a high-level introduction, but I really like them. I think looking at the art is really cool, and I think they do a really good job of introducing the concept of the title in the book itself. So I have been reading a lot from this series, and you can find those reviews on my channel. But today we are doing Music in Medieval Manuscripts. So let's talk about what's in this book and what I learned from this book, what I like about this book and similar books that I might recommend to you. And as always, if you have read this book or if you have other similar books or other thoughts that you would like to share, please put those in the comment section down below. I love to receive them. So let's dive into Music in Medieval Manuscripts. So the book starts off with just a brief introduction of the role music played in medieval times. And something that was really noticeable to me right off the bat in this book was some of the thinkers that were coming up. Two people who were very important to the early or the medieval history of music were Pope Gregory and Boethius. And what struck me about those names is actually a connection to another book that I read last year. It was actually an audiobook. It was a Great Courses audio, and it was about the great thinkers, the great minds of the medieval era. And you can find my review of that on this channel. But it's amazing how frequently these names come up. And I found that other audiobook really helpful because it gave a brief overview of some of these key thinkers of the medieval times, and those names come up again and again. So the first couple pages of this book are just an introduction to the role of music in medieval times, and I think those two names, Pope Gregory in particular, also points to a really key facet of that, and that is a lot of what we know about medieval music and music in medieval times revolves around the church. So there was obviously secular music occurring, but a lot of that wasn't recorded, and what we do have is very slight and only occurs in things like illustrations. Secular music wasn't recorded nearly in the same level that religious music was recorded. So a lot of what we know about music is going to be through the lens of the church as well, and religious music. Secular music we just know much less about, although we do know some, and we do have some evidence that we can glean. So once we get through the introduction, then there's kind of this branch that occurs, and this is a natural branch when we're talking about music in manuscripts, because there is the notation of music, and then there is the marginal illustrations of instruments, musicians, people playing music, music being used. And those are two separate things. An illustration of a musician, maybe over here, or an illustration of instruments, is a different topic than musical notation, which would be something like this. And musical notation, for those who are just really out of their depth or not sure, is what we think of today when we look at this. So if you can't read music, but you still understand the concept here, someone can sit down and know how these notes go together, know how far away they are. And I personally play piano, so I can sit down and I know exactly what these notes are. And sometimes from a modern perspective, we may think that this is just self-explanatory, but we arrived at this modern notation from a series of steps. And there were a lot of variety in the different notations. This just didn't come up out of nowhere. There was a lot of different competing notations that kind of became streamlined into the format that we are familiar with today. And these came from a lot of different religious houses trying to find a way to provide guidance for people who were singing, primarily vocal music. And this section here explains a lot of the history. The first section is a lot of the history behind the notation and building up to the notation that we're familiar with today. So here's a couple of the illustrations. Something that I found really interesting about this section of the book is the discussion in some of the other non-Western European notations that were used. And I say that because these books are quite short. 60, 70 pages, and they really do focus in on medieval manuscripts in Western Europe. And I'm completely okay with that restriction. I mean, at 60, 70 pages, you really can't cover everything, and you do have to be a lot more restrictive. But whenever we step outside that range, I find how little I know about other parts of the world. For example, the author of this book touches on a separate Byzantine notation, which is still used in a limited format, I guess, today in the Orthodox Church, something I know absolutely nothing about. So that was interesting to read and got me thinking. They talked about the Russian Orthodox Church using some of their own, or spinning off and running with their own thing, as well as Armenian Kaz notation, which is its own separate thing, which made me think how much I feel like I read. And I do read quite a bit. I mean, 200 books last year, 190 something books last year, 272 books the year before that. And yet I still feel like I barely scratched the surface on any of these topics. I did quite a bit of reading last fall on medieval Europe, and yet I couldn't tell you anything about this Armenian Kaz notation or what the church looked like in Armenia or the region that we would call that today. Again, I don't know anything about it. Similar to the Byzantine notation, which is included here, that's just these manuscripts are things that I know nothing about, and it was very interesting and unique and different from other books in this series that the author took time to include it and to talk about it. So I really, really liked this, and it really opened my mind to realize how little I know about this, even other half of still Europe that I don't know about, because there's just so much to learn. There's just so much to learn. So the notation part was really interesting, and as the notation develops, we start to get, now we have that, is that called the stave? The lines that kind of tell us where we're going, and things start to standardize in a format that is more familiar to us. So the notation was the first part. Another small connection that I made in this first section is the Christmas, the churning and turning around the Christmas time, the upheaval of social order is referenced in this book. And that was actually in reference to another book that I've read, Dead of Winter, which was an audiobook I listened to about some of the midwinter celebrations that turned social norms on their head around Christmas time. So again, I find a lot of references to other books that I've read in this book as well. Now, the second half of the book focuses a lot on the illustration of music, and that's illustrations, medieval manuscripts that show people playing music and what we can learn about that. And I think this is where we can start to develop maybe more ideas of what music looked like, what instruments were played together, and maybe even what secular music may have looked like. And well, it is interesting. The author also warns that we have to take things with a grain of salt because it can be hard to separate out artistic license from true, accurate depictions in some of these. But there are things that we can kind of learn and glean from these texts. For example, the size of the books that were being used and how they would have been sung, how people would have been stationed, how multiple people would have shared a book. There are things that we can learn when looking at the actual images. The one thing that I found interesting is this unique tradition where there were roles. So a lot of the surviving music are in books, but there were also people who sang from rolls, and these were more temporary, and therefore many of them haven't survived. But there were also these rolls that in these certain churches, they would fall off, that they were meant to fall off like the top of this pulpit. And so they would fall off backwards as the person read from it. So there would be text in one direction, but when it would fall off backwards, there would be illustrations upside down for like the congregants to see, which I thought was really interesting. I had never heard of this before, and this is obviously a surviving one, but there's not many surviving ones of these. So I found that really interesting as well, and something that I had never heard of before, and I'm glad that I was introduced to. Overall, this was a really, really good entrant in the series. I think this medieval manuscript series is really, really interesting, but I am running out of titles in the series to read. I think there's only a couple more that I haven't read at this point, but so far it has been very, very enjoyable. There are, if you are interested in continuing reading about the topic, there's always these further reading sections that have lots of good ideas for you to check out. There's also a list of, in the back, the manuscripts that were referenced, because these books are also very art heavy and art focused. It is 60 to 70 pages, but take your time looking at the art. It's really worthwhile, and I had a really good time reading it. The one thing I might warn of is if you don't have any music background, if you can't read music at all, I do wonder if maybe this would be a little bit more difficult to read. It's hard for me to put myself in those shoes because I do read music and I have from a very young age, so a lot of these concepts were very familiar to me. I don't think they get too technical, and I think it is accessible even if you don't have a strong music background, but I do wonder if maybe that's just me being blind to what I wouldn't know if I didn't play piano. So that is just my one warning, but I think it's worth checking out, even if just for the beautiful illustrations and the interesting history and the interesting art in this series. If you've read this series or have any thoughts or comments, please put it in the comment section down below. I love to hear and receive your thoughts. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.